Sign it, Kaylin. 6 years, and you never once made this company worth what it is today. 6 years of pretending you were the one holding this family together.
Fine.
Kaylin uncaps his father's pen and signs his name at the bottom of the page. His hand does not shake the corner of his mouth, easing into something close to relief, as if this is exactly the moment he has been waiting for. Then slides the folder back across the table, without meeting anyone's eyes. Nobody at that table understood what they had actually just voted to take from him. For 6 years, he had quietly rebuilt Fairmount's numbers until the company looked more profitable than it had in a generation. And hidden inside that same balance sheet, moved into a private trust 2 years earlier and never disclosed at $11,460,000 in guarantees and liabilities that would transfer to whoever held control the instant his name came off the page. What Renata believed she had just won as a reward was about to become the only inheritance she would ever regret fighting for. My name is Kaylin Vance. I am 54 years old. For 6 years, the people at Fairmount Holdings believed I ran that company the way my father used to run his, mostly by sitting at the head of a very long table and letting other people be afraid of me. I let them believe it because the alternative was explaining something I had promised myself I would never explain to anyone until it no longer mattered whether they believed me or not. What I was never good at in all those years was noticing how much of my own breath I had been holding. 3 years before any of this happened, I signed a piece of paper that nobody else in that family ever asked to see past the first page. It sits still inside a folder with a date on it that nobody in that family has ever been curious enough to check. If you have ever paid for everything under a roof and still been the last person asked what you thought about it, stay with me because this is that story, and it does not end the way you expect it to. I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a house my father built with a small construction outfit and a lot of promises he made to men who trusted him more than they should have. When I was 9 years old, I watched 3 of those men stand in our living room and tell my father in front of me that they had always known he would eventually let the family down. He had not let anyone down. He had simply run out of runway 2 months before a contract was set to pay out, and none of them had been willing to wait 2 months to find that out. I remember the exact sound the door made when the last of them left. And I remember that my father did not cry. He just sat down at the kitchen table and started reading through paperwork like the whole conversation had never happened. That was the year I decided I would never again be the person in the room who did not already know what was coming. I went to law school on that decision, and I built a career out of it. And by the time I was 30, I had a name in Chicago for one very specific thing: walking into companies that were quietly dying and finding the one document buried 3 folders deep that nobody else had bothered to read. My mentor in those years was a man named Eldridge, a retired restructuring attorney who used to say that a signature is not surrender. It is an audit of who in the room is actually paying attention. He died the year I turned 40, and I have thought about that line more times than I can count. Eldridge kept a single framed photograph in his office, not of his family, but of a bridge in Cleveland that his firm once helped save from bankruptcy proceedings, without laying off a single one of the 400 workers who kept it running. And he told me once that the photograph was there to remind him that every negotiation is really just an argument about who gets to keep dignity intact. I worked 11 cases under him before he retired. Most of them companies. Nobody outside their own industry had ever heard of 3 of them. Family businesses, not unlike the one I would eventually marry into. And in every single case, the thing that actually destroyed the company was never the debt itself. It was the moment someone in the family stopped being willing to hear bad news from the person best positioned to deliver it. I met Renata the same year I made partner at a fundraiser. Neither of us particularly wanted to, and for a long time I believed we had built something together instead of something that simply happened to both of us at the same time. Her family had founded Fairmount Holdings 2 generations earlier, a modest but respected real estate and infrastructure company anchored around a commercial building on the Gold Coast and a handful of industrial parcels near the river. By the time I married into that family, Fairmount was in worse condition than any of them wanted to admit at the dinner table, carrying debt against buildings that had not been reassessed in over a decade. For most of those first 6 years, I paid the mortgage on the Gold Coast building's operating shortfall directly out of my own income, without ever mentioning it at dinner, because Renata's mother had a way of turning any mention of money into a referendum on whether I belonged at that table at all. I kept a small chipped blue ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter of our apartment, the same one my mother used to keep her rings in before she passed, and every night I came home from the office, I dropped my keys into it, and every night for 6 years, Renata would ask the same question whether the numbers had held again that month, and every night I told her yes, because they always had, and because telling her the truth about how much effort it took to make them hold would have meant explaining a version of myself I had decided at 9 years old never to explain to anyone. She used to tease me gently about how quiet I got whenever Fairmount came up at family dinners, and I used to tell her it was because the numbers bored me, which was the first real lie I ever told her, and very possibly the one I regret most. I spent the first 6 years of our marriage doing quietly for that family exactly what I had built my entire career doing for strangers. Nobody at that table ever thanked me for it in words, because nobody at that table ever fully understood what I had done, and I had structured it that way on purpose. 2 years ago, I sat across from a forensic accountant. I trust more than I trust most of my own family in a conference room on the 9th floor of a building on Wacker Drive. And I asked her a single question, whether it was legally possible to separate the parts of Fairmount Holdings that were actually worth something from the parts that were slowly going to sink the entire family with them. She told me it was possible if I was willing to be the one holding the part that sank. I said yes before she finished the sentence. What I built after that conversation is not something I am ready to explain yet, and I am not going to rush past it just because it would make me look better right now. All I will say for now is that somewhere in a filing cabinet nobody else in my family has ever opened is a private trust with my name on it. And it has been quietly carrying $11,460,000 of Fairmount's most dangerous obligations for 6 years in complete silence, through 3 separate refinancing cycles that nobody at that table ever asked me a single question about. I did not build that structure because I was planning to use it against anyone. I built it because I had watched 3 men stand in my father's living room and decide out loud that he had let them down, and I was not going to let that happen to a family that had actually let me in. The trouble with protecting people quietly for long enough is that eventually they stop remembering there was ever anything to protect them from. By last winter, that was exactly where Renata and I had landed. Renata had been spending most of her time that winter with a man from the acquisition side of the business, a sharp, ambitious associate who had joined Fairmount 3 years earlier and made himself indispensable to her in ways I noticed and chose for a long time not to name out loud. I am not going to pretend I did not see it coming, because a man who spends his career finding the one buried document nobody else read does not miss the pattern sitting across his own dinner table. What I did not expect was the family council meeting itself, called on 4 days' notice in the same conference room where Eldridge used to tell me that a signature is an audit. The conference room sat on the 14th floor of a building on North Michigan Avenue that Fairmount had leased since before I was born, with a window looking directly out over the lake, and I remember thinking walking in that I had negotiated deals worth 10 times more than Fairmount was worth in that exact room for other families, and never once imagined I would sit on this side of the table in it. The receptionist who buzzed me up, a young woman who had worked there less than a year, asked if I wanted coffee the way she always did, and I said no, the way I always did. And it was the last entirely ordinary exchange I would have with anyone at Fairmount Holdings for a very long time. Renata's mother sat at the head of the table that day, flanked by 2 cousins who had not set foot in the Fairmount offices in over a decade. And I understood within the first 90 seconds that the entire meeting had been built around one document and one signature, and I was the only person in the room who had not been told in advance what that document said. They told me Fairmount's board had lost confidence in my leadership over the past 6 years, citing a real estate portfolio that had underperformed every projection the family had circulated privately among themselves. Nobody at that table mentioned the $11 million in obligations I had personally been carrying to keep those same projections from collapsing entirely, because nobody at that table knew it existed. Renata did the talking mostly, and she did it well in the same calm and reasonable voice she used to use when she was still proud to introduce me to people as her husband. She told me the family had decided unanimously that control of Fairmount Holdings needed to move to someone who could, in her words, actually be present. I asked to read the document before I signed anything. And I did read it slowly, twice, while 6 people who had all clearly already discussed exactly how long that would take sat and waited for me to finish. It transferred every share of Fairmount Holdings I personally held, along with all operating control of the company, directly to Renata, effective immediately. Somewhere near the end of that reading, her mother said the thing I suspect had been rehearsed the longest. That 6 years of pretending to hold this family together was a strange thing to walk away from so quietly. I did not correct her, because correcting her would have required explaining a trust she did not know existed in front of a man I did not trust with the information, and I had promised myself a long time ago that I would never again explain myself to a room that had already made up its mind before I walked in. Renata asked if there was anything I wanted to say before we proceeded. And for a moment I considered telling her everything, every filing, every guarantee, every year of silence. And then I looked at the man sitting 1 seat down from her, and I understood that whatever I said in that room would reach him within the hour. I said no. I uncapped the pen my father had given me the year I passed the bar, the same pen I had used on every contract that mattered to me since. And I signed my name once at the bottom of the last page, and I slid the folder back across the table without looking up at any of them. Renata's mother said something about the pen being a strange thing to still be sentimental about. And one of the cousins laughed, and I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and asked where I should leave my access badge. Nobody in that room, including Renata, understood what they had actually just been handed, and I did not say a single word to correct that, because the entire structure I had spent 6 years building depended on nobody understanding it until they were ready to. I packed the contents of my office into 2 boxes that afternoon, left my badge with the front desk, and drove north out of the city without telling anyone where I was going, including Renata. I kept exactly 3 things out of that office: a framed photograph of my father standing in front of the house he built before it all came apart, the pen, and a small brass nameplate that used to sit on Eldridge's desk before it sat on mine, engraved simply with the words that had outlasted him. Everything else, 6 years of files awards from industry associations, that meant nothing to me. A company mug Renata had given me the first Christmas we were married. I left exactly where it sat, because none of it belonged to the version of myself I intended to be from that afternoon forward. I own a small cabin 2 hours north of the city on a lake my father used to take me to before his company failed. And that is where I went that first night, because it was the only place I had never once brought Renata or the man from acquisitions or anyone from that conference room. I did not call anyone for 4 days. I did not explain myself to my own attorney. And I certainly did not explain myself to Nia, the paralegal, who had quietly kept better records of my work than I had kept myself for most of the last 6 years. People who knew me from the office called that silence defeat. And for a while I let them, because the alternative was telling them I had spent 2 years building something I was not yet willing to describe out loud, not even to the people who loved me. What none of them understood, sitting around that conference table with a folder they believed made them powerful, was a simple fact I had learned from watching my father's living room empty out when I was 9 years old. The people who take something without asking what it actually is are always eventually the ones who find out the hard way. I was not hiding from what had happened in that room. I was waiting to see what they would do with what they thought they had won. Because that, more than any document, was the thing I had actually been testing for 6 years. I did not see most of what happened at Fairmount over the following weeks with my own eyes, and I want to be honest about that. Because everything I am about to tell you came to me afterward in pieces from people who were actually standing in the room when it happened. Nia called me on the 5th day, not to check on me, but to tell me she had been asked to box up my files for what the new leadership was calling an internal audit. She told me later that when she went to gather the files from the trust filing, the drawer had already been searched carefully by someone who did not know what they were looking for and had clearly given up before finding it. I had built the Marigold Trust 2 years earlier, specifically, so that anyone searching that drawer would find exactly nothing, because the real filing sat under a name that meant nothing to anyone at that table but me and one accountant on Wacker Drive. Nia is the kind of person who notices when a room has been searched because for 6 years, she was the only other person at Fairmount who understood how carefully I filed things, and she told me the search had unsettled her more than anything Renata had said out loud that week. Nia had come to Fairmount 9 years earlier, straight out of a paralegal program hired originally by Renata's mother to file paperwork nobody else wanted to deal with, and within a year, I had quietly started routing her the parts of my own work that required the most discretion. Not because anyone told me to trust her, but because I watched her for an entire year, never once repeat a piece of information she had not been explicitly told she could share. That is a rarer quality than people think. Especially inside a family business, where everybody eventually learns that the fastest way to feel important is to be the one who knew something first. Nia never once tried to feel important that way, not in 9 years, and I have come to believe that quality is worth more to a company than any degree hanging on a wall. She began keeping her own records after that. Quietly the same way I had taught her, without ever meaning to teach her anything at all. It was Nia who eventually gave me copies of the messages exchanged between Renata and the man from Acquisitions. In the weeks after I signed messages she should not have had access to, and which I am still not entirely certain how she obtained. 2 days after the signing, Renata wrote that the Gold Coast building alone was worth more than either of them had originally estimated, and that with me finally out of the way, refinancing it for the resort conversion they had been discussing privately for over a year would finally be possible. The man wrote back that the only real risk left was whether anyone else in the family would ask to see the full loan structure before the refinancing closed. And Renata wrote that she doubted it because nobody else in that family had ever cared to understand Fairmount's finances as long as the checks cleared. Reading that sentence was the first time since the signing that I let myself feel something close to anger, not because she was wrong about the family, but because she was without knowing it, describing exactly the blind spot I had spent 6 years quietly standing inside of. A week later, in a message I have also read more times than I should probably admit, Renata wrote that she sometimes wondered whether I had ever actually loved Fairmount at all, or whether I had simply loved being the only person who understood it. The man wrote back that it did not matter anymore either way. Since I was gone and Renata did not respond to that message for 6 hours, according to the timestamp Nia sent me, which is the only piece of that entire exchange that ever made me feel something close to sympathy for her. 2 years before the signing, I restructured Fairmount Holdings so that every asset actually worth protecting the Gold Coast building's equity above its original debt, the 2 industrial parcels near the river that had appreciated the most, and a modest but stable portfolio of long-term leases sat inside the Marigold Trust held entirely in my name, outside of Fairmount Holdings itself. What remained inside, Fairmount Holdings, the entity Renata now controlled completely, was the operating shell, including every personal guarantee I had signed over the previous 6 years to keep the family's original lenders from calling their loans, along with a deferred tax liability from a reassessment the family had been quietly avoiding since before I ever married into it. The moment Renata's name replaced mine as the controlling party of Fairmount Holdings, every one of those guarantees and liabilities transferred with the entity, because a guarantee runs with control, not with blood. A fact any competent attorney would have told her to check before that meeting was ever called. Any first-year associate at a firm like the one I trained at would have flagged the successor liability language in Fairmount's original operating agreement within an hour of being asked to review it, because it is the kind of clause that exists specifically to prevent a controlling party from walking away from obligations by simply changing who holds the title. Renata's family had insisted on that language themselves 15 years earlier, after a cousin on her father's side tried to strip value out of a different family property before selling his interest and leaving everyone else to cover what was left behind. They wrote the clause to protect themselves from exactly that kind of departure, never once imagining that a departure could look from the outside like a total surrender instead of an escape. Nobody checked because checking would have meant asking me a question, and asking me a question was the one thing that conference room had been specifically designed to avoid. I had spent 6 years hoping I would never actually need this structure, and I want to be honest that a part of me still hoped right up until the morning of that meeting that Renata would ask me even one real question before they handed me that folder. She did not ask. That is not a cruelty I inflicted on her. It is simply the shape of the trap she and her mother built for themselves 4 days in advance around a man they had decided without checking was no longer worth asking anything at all. I never told Renata about the trust, not because I wanted to hide something from my own wife, but because I had learned at 9 years old exactly what happens to a man who tells a room full of people that he is quietly protecting them from something they cannot see. They do not thank him. They decide eventually that he must be the danger he claims to be protecting them from, and they turn on him for it long before anything he warned them about ever actually arrives. I watched 3 of my father's oldest partners do exactly that in our living room. And I promised myself at 9 years old, sitting on the bottom stair where nobody could see me, that I would rather carry a burden alone for the rest of my life than ever again be the person accused of inventing a danger just to look important. Eldridge used to say that the loneliest job in restructuring law was the one where you did it well enough that nobody ever knew there had been a fire to put out in the first place. I did not understand for most of my career that he was also describing a marriage. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being good at a thing. Nobody's allowed to know you are doing it, and I do not think I let myself feel the full weight of it until the night Nia sent me those messages, sitting at a kitchen table, 2 hours from anyone who had ever called me their husband. I thought that night about all the dinners I had sat through where Renata's mother made some small comment about how little I contributed beyond a law degree and a quiet temperament, and how I had smiled through every single one of them. Because correcting her would have meant explaining a trust I was not yet ready to explain, and because some part of me, the part still sitting on that bottom stair at 9 years old, had convinced itself that being quietly indispensable was its own kind of love, even when nobody around that table ever called it that. Whatever else was true about the man from Acquisitions. And there is a great deal I still do not know. He was genuinely gifted at reading a distressed property, faster than almost anyone I trained with over the years, capable of walking through a building once and telling you within a rounding error what it would take to convert it into something worth twice as much. That gift is, I think, part of what drew Renata to him in the first place, not simply attention, but the particular relief of being around someone who made the future feel solvable again, after 6 years of a marriage that had started to feel to her like an unsolved problem. She had stopped trying to work through Renata's fear, the one I understood best. After a decade of marriage, went back to her own father who had controlled every account in their household so completely that her mother did not know the balance of their own savings until the week he died, and Renata had spent her entire adult life terrified of ending up in a version of that same silence, dependent on a husband's arithmetic instead of her own. I understood that fear. And for most of our marriage, I thought I had built enough transparency into our life together to prove I was not her father. I understand now that transparency about the checking account and transparency about a trust holding $11 million of hidden risk are not remotely the same thing, and that from where she was standing, I had quietly become exactly the kind of husband she had spent her whole life afraid of marrying. Eldridge had a second line he used less often when I only understood fully, after all of this happened, that the difference between a strategist and a coward is simply whether the silence they keep is in service of a plan or in service of an escape. I have asked myself more than once these past months which one I actually was for those 6 years. And I am no longer certain the honest answer is as flattering as I would like it to be. Nia grew up the daughter of a woman who cleaned office buildings on the very same block as Fairmount's headquarters for over 20 years. And she once told me that the first thing her mother taught her about wealthy families was that they always assumed the quiet people in the room understood the least. when in her mother's experience, it was almost always the opposite. By the time Nia sent me those messages, I understood it completely, and I understood something else along with it, that the family council had not simply taken Fairmount Holdings from me. They had taken exactly what I had built the entire structure to give away on the condition that they never find out what it actually was until it was too late to undo it. I did not feel triumphant reading those messages at my kitchen table on the lake, and I want to be honest about that too. Because a large part of what I felt was grief for a marriage that had ended in a conference room, instead of in either of our kitchens, and for a version of myself that had spent 6 years being useful instead of simply being known. By early spring, according to what Nia later pieced together from the Fairmount accounting files, Renata and the man from acquisitions had scheduled a refinancing closing on the Gold Coast building for the middle of June, tied to the resort conversion they had been planning together for over a year before I ever signed anything. The bank they approached required a full audit of Fairmount Holdings' existing obligations before releasing new capital, a standard requirement that any of Fairmount's previous lenders would have told them to expect, and one that neither Renata nor the man beside her seemed particularly worried about. For 6 years, I had made Fairmount Holdings' finances look calm enough, quietly enough, that everyone around that table had stopped believing there was anything underneath them worth auditing at all. That more than any single document was the real inheritance I left behind in that conference room. A company that looked exactly as safe as I had spent 6 years, making it look right up until the moment someone else's name was the only one attached to it. I spent most of that spring at the cabin, and if I am honest, very little of it was spent thinking about revenge, because revenge had never actually been the point of anything I built. I fixed the dock that had been sagging since my father's last summer alive, and in the evenings I started going through a box of his old ledgers I had never once opened, mostly because I finally had the kind of silence that lets a person do something like that. My father kept those ledgers the old way, in pencil, correcting his own arithmetic in the margins, rather than erasing it, and reading through 6 years of his handwriting taught me something about him I had never understood as a child, that he had known for at least 2 years before it happened that the company was in trouble, and had simply kept working every single day as though knowing were the same thing as fixing it. I recognized the feeling immediately because I had spent 6 years doing something close to the opposite, working every single day, as though fixing it quietly were the same thing as never having to admit it was broken in the first place. Neither approach, I have come to think sitting on this porch now, was entirely the right one. Nia called every few weeks, not to update me exactly, but because I think she needed somewhere to put what she was seeing, and I had become, without either of us quite deciding it, the only person left who understood the shape of what she was describing. She told me the man from acquisitions had started asking her casually at first, and then less casually, whether I had ever mentioned any other accounts or trusts to her over the years. She told him no every time, and she told me later that the more he asked, the more she started to wonder whether he was asking because he suspected I had hidden something, or because he had started suspecting Renata of hiding something from him. By April, according to what Nia saw firsthand, the two of them had stopped presenting a united front in front of the rest of the family council, disagreeing openly in meetings about whether the resort conversion needed a second appraisal before the refinancing closed. Renata wanted to move quickly, worried that any delay would give the rest of the family time to ask questions she did not yet have good answers for. The man wanted to slow down, worried that moving too quickly on a company he did not fully control yet would leave him exposed if anything went wrong. Neither of them, Nia told me, ever considered that the thing most likely to go wrong was something I had already finished doing 2 years before either of them started arguing about it. Twice that spring, I drove into the small town near the lake for supplies, and both times the man who ran the hardware store asked how the family business was doing, because he had known my father back before either of our families had any money worth discussing, and both times I told him it was doing fine, which was strictly speaking true of the trust and a significant lie about everything else. There is a particular kind of comfort in being somewhere nobody expects you to explain your circumstances, And I understood standing in that hardware store buying nails for a dock that did not strictly need fixing yet, why my father used to disappear up here for entire weekends during the worst years of his own company's collapse. By the end of May, Nia told me the tension inside Fairmount's offices had become obvious, even to people who were never involved in any of it. An assistant 2 floors down mentioned to her, almost as a joke, that the 9th floor had started to feel like a house nobody wanted to walk through after dark. Renata, according to Nia, began working later and later into the evenings alone, going back through the same loan documents I had filed 6 years earlier, looking Nia believed for exactly the kind of irregularity she did not yet know how to name. She never found the Marigold Trust filing because it was never inside any of the boxes labeled Fairmount at all. And I have thought more than once about what it must have felt like for her sitting alone in that office at 9 at night, certain that something was wrong and unable to prove it to herself, let alone to anyone else. I received one message from Renata that spring, a single line sent at 2 in the morning in early May, asking simply whether I still had access to any of the original Fairmount loan files from before we were married. I read it perhaps 30 times before deciding not to answer it at all. Not out of cruelty, but because I did not yet know how to answer a question like that, honestly without answering every other question underneath it as well, and I was not ready that week to do that. She never sent a second message, and I have wondered since whether she regretted the first one or whether she simply assumed my silence was its own kind of answer. By late April, Nia told me Renata had quietly begun exploring whether the family's original lender, a regional bank that had financed Fairmount's very first acquisition 2 generations earlier, might be willing to refinance the Gold Coast building on more favorable terms than the resort conversion required, a conversation she apparently had without telling the man from acquisitions at all. He found out about it 3 weeks later from a mutual acquaintance rather than from her. And he said the argument that followed was the first one loud enough that people 2 offices away could hear parts of it through the wall. I do not know exactly what was said in that argument, and Nia was careful even with me about repeating details she had only overheard secondhand, but she told me it ended with the man from acquisitions asking Renata directly whether she had ever actually planned to make him an equal partner in anything, or whether he had simply been useful in the same way it seemed to him that I once had been. The suspicion between them did not stay confined to business decisions for long. Nia told me that by May, Renata had started asking her, in the kind of offhand tone people use when they think they are being subtle, whether the man from acquisitions had ever asked her anything strange or asked to see any files he should not have needed. I think, and this is only what I believe having known her for most of a decade, that she had simply reached the part of any arrangement built on secrecy, where every person inside it starts wondering what the others are keeping from them, because that is the natural endpoint of a structure built on not asking questions. The man, for his part, began quietly meeting with a different accountant of his own, one Nia recognized from an earlier stage of his career. And she told me she suspected he was trying to understand Fairmount's real financial position without either me or Renata finding out he was looking. He never asked Nia directly for anything that would have compromised her, and I want to be fair to him for that, because it would have been very easy for him to try. What he did do twice was ask her whether she thought Renata trusted him completely. A question Nia found strange enough that she wrote it down the same night in a notebook I did not know she kept until she showed it to me much later. In late May, the man from acquisitions asked her directly to adjust a set of figures being prepared for the bank, thinking a large rounding difference in the projected occupancy rate for the Gold Coast building that would have made the resort conversion look marginally less risky on paper. Nia refused quietly and without making a scene about it, and within a week, she was moved off the refinancing file entirely and told her hours were being reduced for the summer. She called me the night she got that news, and it was the only time in this entire story that I heard her voice break. Not because of the money she told me, but because 6 years of doing her job carefully had apparently mattered less to the people running that company now than 6 weeks of doing whatever she was told. I did not tell her what to do next. I only told her that carefully was still the only way I knew how to be useful to anyone, and that it had taken me most of my life to stop needing someone else to notice that before it counted. There were nights that spring When I considered calling Renata directly, not to explain anything, but simply to ask how she was, the way I would have without thinking twice about it for the better part of a decade, and every time I picked up my phone to do it, I put it back down because I no longer entirely trusted. Which part of me wanted to make that call, the husband who still loved her, in some complicated, unfinished way? Or the architect who wanted to know whether his structure was working exactly as designed? I am still not certain even now which one would have answered if she had picked up. Nia's mother passed that same spring, quietly, after a short illness, and I drove down for the funeral without telling anyone at Fairmount. I had done so because by then Nia had become the one person in my life I trusted completely. And I understood, standing in the back of that small church, that loyalty built in silence over 9 years does not simply disappear because the silence eventually breaks. She thanked me afterward for coming and told me it was the first time in months that anyone in her life had shown up for her without needing something from her in return, and I told her honestly that I understood the feeling better than she probably realized. By the first week of June, according to everything, Nia later reconstructed for me, both Renata and the man from acquisitions had stopped speaking to each other outside of scheduled meetings, entirely communicating instead through a shared assistant, who Nia said seemed to sense better than either of them did that something large was about to arrive, whether they were ready for it or not. The bank's audit team arrived at the Fairmount offices on the second week of June, 3 days before the scheduled closing, to conduct what they described in their engagement letter as a standard review of existing obligations attached to the entity taking on new debt. Nobody at Fairmount Holdings, according to Nia, thought that review would take longer than an afternoon. It took 11 days. I was not in that building for any part of what happened over those 11 days and everything I know about it. I know because Nia was there for the first 3, and because Renata's own attorney, a man who had once worked with me years earlier on an entirely different matter, called me directly on the 12th day, which is not something attorneys usually do, and which told me on its own how badly that conversation was about to go for everyone else involved. The audit team's first finding, according to that call, was a set of personal guarantees attached to 3 of Fairmount's original construction loans, each one signed by me individually rather than by the company, each one still active and each one now legally the responsibility of whoever currently controlled Fairmount Holdings, which meant Renata. The second finding was the deferred tax liability from the reassessment the family had been avoiding for over a decade, a liability that had grown quietly every year. It went unaddressed, and which the bank's own actuaries valued as of that June at just over $11 million. The third finding, the one Renata's attorney told me had actually gone silent in the room when he read it aloud, was a clause inside the original transfer document. The very folder I had signed in that conference room, stating plainly that all existing obligations of Fairmount Holdings transferred to its new controlling party immediately upon execution. Her own family had written that clause themselves, years before any of this, as standard boilerplate, meant to protect the company from exactly the kind of ambiguity that might let a departing partner walk away from responsibilities they no longer wanted. Nobody in that conference room, 4 days before they called me in to sign, had thought to ask whether the clause might someday work against them instead of for them. I have since learned, mostly from Nia, that the actuaries the bank brought in spent 3 of those 11 days solely on the deferred tax liability, cross-referencing county assessment records, going back 14 years, because the number involved was large enough that they wanted to be certain it was not the result of a clerical error, rather than a genuine decade-long pattern of avoidance. It was not a clerical error. And by the 7th day, according to the same source, the bank's team had begun asking Renata's own attorney directly whether the family had any additional undisclosed obligations they should be aware of before proceeding any further, a question I understand she was not able to answer with any real confidence. Renata's mother, who had sat at the head of the table the day I signed, attended exactly 1 day of that 11-day audit, according to Nia, and left after the second finding was read aloud, saying only that she needed air and did not return to the Fairmount offices again that month. I have wondered more than once whether she understood faster than her daughter did, that the family had not simply lost a piece of paper's worth of value, but had lost the one person in 3 generations of Fairmount Holdings who had ever fully understood what was actually holding the company up. Renata's attorney told me she read that clause 3 times before she said anything at all. When she finally spoke, she did not ask about me, and she did not ask about the money first. She asked whether there was any way to undo the signing itself, and he had to tell her as gently as a man can tell a client something like this, that 6 weeks was well past any window in which that would have been possible. The man from acquisitions was in the room for the second finding, and according to Nia, who was still present for the first 3 days before her hours ended entirely, he did not say a single word until the meeting broke for the afternoon. When it resumed, he asked Renata in front of the bank's team and 2 members of her own family whether she had known about the guarantees before the signing. She told him no, and I believe her because I never told anyone about them. Not even the one accountant on Wacker Drive, who helped me build the trust that held everything else. He did not believe her, or he believed her, and was angry anyway. And either way, Nia told me he stood up, said something quiet that she could not fully hear, and left the building before the meeting had officially ended. He did not come back the next day or the day after that. And by the time the audit closed on its 11th day, the resort conversion he had spent over a year planning with Renata had been shelved indefinitely, along with, as far as I know, whatever else had existed between the 2 of them outside of that conference room. The final tally. The bank's team presented on the 11th day put Fairmount Holdings' actual net position once every guarantee and every year of deferred tax liability was accounted for at just under $4 million below zero. A number that meant the resort conversion loan could not close under any structure the bank was willing to offer, and that Renata, as the entity's sole controlling party, was now personally exposed to a portion of that shortfall under the terms of the guarantees she had inherited without ever agreeing to them by name. Nia told me she saw him one more time after that in the lobby of the building, collecting a single box of his own belongings, and that he did not ask to see Renata before he left, and that the security guard at the front desk, a man who had worked there almost as long as Nia had told her afterward, that it was the quietest exit he had ever watched in 15 years of watching people leave that building for the last time. I did not learn any of this the way you might expect in a single dramatic phone call, meant to satisfy something in me that wanted to hear her voice break the way Nia's had. I learned it in pieces over about a week, mostly from an attorney doing his job, and a paralegal who had every reason in the world to stop caring what happened to either of us, and somehow never did. I felt many things reading through all of it, but I did not feel the thing I had expected to feel. For 6 years, whenever I let myself imagine a moment like this one, I did not feel like I had won anything. Renata's attorney told me near the end of that same call that she had asked him quietly, after everyone else left the room, whether he thought I had known this would happen when I signed, and he told her he could not answer that question because it was not one a lawyer could answer on my behalf. Only I could. I have turned that question over many times since sitting on this porch, and the truest answer I have is that I hoped it would happen. And I built carefully enough that it did not depend on hope to work. Fairmount Holdings itself did not collapse entirely in the end, largely because the bank agreed to restructure the remaining obligations over an extended timeline rather than call them all at once. A courtesy, I understand, the bank extended partly out of respect for the Fairmount name in Chicago's business community, and partly, according to Renata's attorney, because the pension provisions I had built into the Marigold Trust made the bank's own risk committee more comfortable that the company's remaining employees would not be the ones left absorbing the damage. There was one thing I had arranged quietly in the same 2 years I built the Marigold Trust that had nothing to do with punishing anyone and everything to do with the promise I made myself at 9 years old on the bottom stair of my parents' house. Before I ever signed that folder, I had structured the trust so that the pension obligations owed to every long-term Fairmount employee, including people who had worked there since before Renata's mother ran the company, would continue to be honored, regardless of who controlled the operating entity, funded quietly out of the trust itself, rather than out of Fairmount's collapsing balance sheet. Nia's own pension was inside that provision, though she did not know it until her attorney called to explain why her benefits had not been affected by any of what happened that June. I did not do that to be forgiven by anyone, and I have never told Renata it exists, and I am not certain even now that I ever will. I did it because somewhere between watching my father's living room empty out and signing my name to a folder, 6 years into my own marriage, I decided that the difference between power and cruelty is simply what you choose to protect when nobody is asking you to protect anything at all. I am writing the last part of this from the porch of the cabin in the first real week of spring with my father's ledgers finally back in the order they should have been kept in the whole time he was alive. I sold nothing from the Marigold Trust in the months after the audit closed, and I have not touched the $11 million that once sat quietly beneath everyone's notice, because none of that was ever the point of building it. I gave the Gold Coast building back to Fairmount Holdings, outright free of the trust's claim on it, on the condition that the pension provisions stayed exactly as I had structured them. A condition Renata's family accepted within a week. Mostly, I think, because nobody left standing in that company had the appetite left to argue with me about anything. I did not ask for anything else, and I have not spoken to Renata since the day I signed that folder, though. I understand from Nia that she has moved out of the Gold Coast apartment and is staying for now with her mother. I do not know if she has forgiven herself for not asking me a single question in that room. And I have stopped expecting that I will ever find out. What I know instead, sitting here with a pocket watch of my father's that has not run in over 30 years, finally taking a new mainspring, is something I was not ready to say out loud until this exact week. I spent my entire adult life building the kind of quiet, careful power that meant I would never again be the person left standing in an emptying room. And somewhere inside all that careful building, I forgot to ask anyone, including myself, whether I actually wanted to be loved instead of simply protected. That is the knife of this whole story. And it is mine to carry, not Renata's, and not the man from acquisitions, and not even my father's. I think about the 3 men who stood in my father's living room more often than I used to. And I have started to wonder whether my father ever wanted to be asked by any one of them, whether he was afraid, instead of simply being asked whether the numbers would hold. I never asked him that question either, not once in all the years I had left with him before he passed, because I had learned by then that our family did not ask each other that kind of question. We simply asked whether the numbers would hold. And I built an entire life and an entire marriage around answering that question so well that nobody ever thought to ask me the other one. The book. I have spent the longest on this spring is not one of my father's ledgers, but a small leather-bound journal of Eldridge's that his family gave me after he passed, mostly blank, except for the first 11 pages, where he had written out in his own hand every piece of advice he most regretted not saying to his own son before it was too late to say it. I have started filling the remaining pages myself slowly, not with legal advice, but with the things I want whoever eventually reads it to understand about the difference between protecting people and simply managing them. A distinction I did not fully understand myself until I had already spent 6 years failing to draw it inside my own marriage. I called my own attorney 2 weeks ago for the first time since the signing, not about Fairmount, but to update the paperwork on the cabin itself so that it passes someday directly to Nia's niece. A bright, careful girl of 12 who reminds me more than I have told anyone of exactly the kind of person I hope eventually inherits whatever it is I actually managed to build out of all of this. It felt strange signing my name to something again in a much smaller conference room than the one on North Michigan Avenue. And I noticed doing it that my hand did not shake at all, which surprised me more than almost anything else that has happened this year. I do not know if Renata and I will ever speak again, and I have made a kind of peace with not knowing the same peace it took me 45 years to make, with the sound of my father's front door closing on the last of his old partners. What I know is that the version of myself who dropped his keys into a chipped blue ceramic bowl every night for 6 years, quietly measuring whether the numbers had held, is not the version of myself sitting on this porch right now. And I find most mornings that I do not miss him nearly as much as I expected to. Nia visited the cabin 2 weeks ago on her way back from her sister's place further north and she sat with me on this same porch while I wound that watch for the first time since I was a boy. And neither of us said very much, because for the first time in 6 years, there was nothing left that needed to be carefully managed between us. I let go of the trust's remaining claim on the industrial parcels. The following week, transferring them back to Fairmount Holdings without condition, because I no longer needed them to prove anything to anyone, including myself. The watch is running now, quietly on the small table beside me. And for the first time in longer than I can accurately remember, I am not listening for the sound of a door about to close. Some mornings, I still reach for my phone before I remember. There is no longer anyone at Fairmount and expecting a call from me by 9. And I have started using that particular kind of silence, the reflexive reach followed by the empty hand, as a small private measure of how much of myself I am slowly getting back. The lake outside this porch froze twice more before it finally broke apart for the season, and I watched both times from exactly this chair, with exactly this watch ticking beside me, thinking about how long it takes a thing to unfreeze, once it has been solid enough for long enough that everyone around it forgets it was ever capable of moving again. Nia has started spending more of her weekends up here than either of us probably meant for her to, mostly helping me organize the ledgers into something resembling an actual archive. And last month she told me, half joking, that she was beginning to understand why my father never wanted to leave this lake either, once he finally had the chance to just sit beside it. I told her that was probably the truest thing anyone has said to me all year. There is a version of this story where I tell you I feel nothing at all when I think about Renata now. And I want to be honest, that it would be a lie, because 6 years of a marriage do not simply dissolve because the structure underneath them finally surfaced, and I still on certain evenings catch myself wondering whether she is doing all right in whatever version of all right is left available to her now. I do not know yet what comes after this spring. And for the first time in my adult life, I find that I am not in a hurry to build a structure that answers that question in advance. If you are the man in this story who has spent years being useful before you were ever asked whether you wanted to be known, I hope you find one small thing this week that you protect simply because you choose to, not because anyone asked you to prove it. If you are the woman listening to this in your kitchen tonight, and you have already decided, the way you always do that, you are on his side. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to a porch instead of a courtroom. Wind something back to life this week, an old clock, an old friendship, an old version of yourself you put away carefully a long time ago, and let it run for a while without asking it to prove anything to you first. And if you are neither of them, if you are simply someone who stayed because the story surprised you, thank you for that too. Because that is exactly what I hope this porch and this watch and this whole strange year taught me how to offer people again the chance to surprise me back.